All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Travis Cram. I'm the director of the University of Wyoming debate team, and I have been involved in some capacity or another with debate for um, really the last 10 years of my life. I was originally a debater for a very small school in Wyoming called Cheyenne East High School. I still think it's the best school in the country. And part of the reasons that made my experience so great and also what set me up for a lot of success in a lifetime of debate was some of the core lessons that I learned involving judge adaptation. So my goal here today is to give you some bit of general background in terms of some of the reasons why we want to adapt in debate, especially policy debate, and also give a little bit of insight into some of the different ways that judges have of seeing debate. And I'm following along on the live stream comments, and I will try to give some time near the end to answer any specific questions that you might have. So feel free to chip in and provide your own question, and I will do my best to make sure that it gets addressed. To begin with, though, I want to kind of lay out an experience that I've heard from debaters that's basically as old as time, as old as the activity, which is, oh, we got really screwed out of that decision. That judge did not know what was going on. That judge was beyond saving. And this is an attitude that I think is really unproductive, to say the least, because as long as they show up and they are have a ballot with them and they have the ability to vote AF or vote neg, there is a way to win their ballot. And I don't know about you all, but I'm pretty competitive. I enjoy being successful at debate, and so I want to get as many ballots as I possibly can. And I also think that I see a similar kind of remark from the other sort of perspective when I talk to people who haven't judged a lot of debate or aren't very familiar with the activity, who say, oh, CX is too technical and too fast. And I think that kind of misses the mark, because no debate format is kind of inherently one way or another. I think that it all boils down to the participants in that round, whether the students or whether the judge failed to kind of understand communication is a two-way street, and the burden certainly is on the debaters to adapt, but we should be encouraging people to adapt as well as they can. Now, the first thing that I like to do whenever I talk about this subject with debaters is to kind of set down one big ground rule, which is adaptation is not changing the rate at which you argue. It is changing how you argue. It changes the types of arguments that you will populate in your speeches, because regardless of sort of the style that debate takes, the more important thing in a judge's mind are the assumptions they bring with them to the activity. And every judge has these assumptions. Everyone, whether they've judged 5,000 debates or one debate, has some expectation in their head about who will play what role and what kind of things will be discussed. So the key part of adaptation is to try to understand what are the judge's assumptions and how can I sort of transform my arguments to fit into that worldview. Because every single person has a worldview. They have a set of terms that helps them kind of make sense of content and ideas and arguments that they hear in everyday life when they're reading the newspaper or when they are scrolling through their social media feeds. And those same assumptions and worldview carries with it into debate rounds, even in moments where you have judges who will tell you that it's all about what I flow or what I write down. That's the only thing I'll judge on. That's not always 100% accurate. Everyone brings a certain set of baggage and assumptions to the table, and successful debaters will try to break that down and understand it. Now, when I say it's not about trying to move on from kind of this broader rationale of why we need to adapt, I do want to kind of start kind of helping to break down in practice when adaptation occurs. Now, when I ask this question in front of a live audience, when is the first time adaptation starts? A lot of times I hear the answer, well, it begins when you ask, hey, judge, what is your paradigm? And that is supposed to yield some magical knowledge that will tell you how to change all of your arguments and how to switch everything around. So from that perspective, adaptation begins when you ask the judge what their expectations are. And that's often two ways. The first is adaptation, really, I think, in the sense of how you are perceived and the type of persona that you're placing on, begins as soon as you get on the bus to go to the tournament. And what I mean by that is it's very difficult if you have a judge who has expectations that you're going to conduct yourself professionally and that you won't act running around like a chicken with your head cut off or any of those sorts of things. If you only turn on that part of your charm when you walk in the room, a judge may be hesitant to kind of forgive things that they witnessed or a rude interaction you may have had with them in the cafeteria. And this isn't just hyperbole. I've known many people that have had moments come back to bite them where they perhaps said things on Facebook or it was crossx.com back in my day, come back to haunt them in a lost ballot in a pretty big elim in a state championship. So the key thing to keep in mind is that adaptation really does kind of continue every single second that a tournament is going on. And the second thing that you'll also realize, adaptation starts while you're writing your arguments. If you were to prepare your arguments for the most technical, savvy audience, someone like me who's been around debate for a decade and actively coaches it at the college level, and you were to shape and polish all your affirmative cases, all of your negative positions for me, you can't just shut that off and radically change what you're saying or what you're doing when you get in front of a judge who doesn't share my assumptions or my experience. So adaptation really does begin back in your own squad room, back at home, when you're working and preparing on your own positions. You have to think through, what are my audiences that I'm likely to encounter, and how can I prepare to win any of those audiences? So adaptation, I think, really is more of a philosophy of how to approach debate than just a thing you do in the moment. Now, with that said, I do want to kind of point out it does help to kind of build a taxonomy or a categorization of types of judges that you might encounter that are out there. And usually you'll see these referred to as different judging paradigms. And that's a fancy $10 word we use to really just say judging worldview or judging assumptions. The paradigms that we classically talk about in policy debate, and these really these emerged from debate discussion among debate coaches many decades ago. But the classic ones are, obviously, there is the stock issues, and the stock issues sort of shares the kind of borrows from a courtroom model of argumentation, where the affirmative has a burden of proof to advance what's called a prima facie case. Prima facie is a Latin term that means on face. And sort of the direct way of understanding this is, can you present an affirmative that sort of stands up to common sense scrutiny? And the way that stock issues judges have evolved kind of a benchmark for understanding whether the AF does pass common sense scrutiny is by asking whether it fulfills the key stock issues of inherency, harms and significance, which are related, solvency, and whether it is also topical. Now, some people will quibble over how many stock issues we should have, what order they should be in, can we make them spell something clever in an acronym? But the key assumption in terms of structuring stock issues debate is that the affirmative has the burden to win every single stock issue, whereas the negative only needs to kind of knock out one of them, with the assumption that if an affirmative case is missing any of the core stock issues, then it does not pass the prima facie on face test. So they have not fulfilled their burden of proof. You can think of this through the analogy of a courtroom trial. The prosecution has the burden to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that someone is guilty of a crime. So if the defense can knock any single hole in the case, the entire thing unravels. So I do think that stock issues is best thought of through that sort of like analogy of the courtroom. The second big one is the policymaker paradigm. And this is where the judge takes sort of a hypothetical role that they play as kind of a member of Congress or a member of a legislative or governing body. And they ask what would be the best policy to advocate for by the end of the debate. So the key debate mechanics here are not necessarily concerned with whether the affirmative has all of the stock issues, but whether the affirmative presents an important policy change from the status quo or the currently existing state of affairs. And policymaking, as you can guess, and this is one that I think it has become really the dominant that sort of assumption that a lot of judges have, is all about costs and benefits. Does the affirmative achieve more benefit or advantages than they incur costs or disadvantages? So the expectation for the affirmative is at the end of the debate round, they have to have achieved the largest impact or advantage for the plan that is greater than any disads or costs. Whereas the role for the negative team is to either prove that the disadvantages to the AF are so great that the status quo is worth keeping even if it's imperfect, or they have to advance an alternative policy, such as a counter plan, or in some cases a critique alternative. And this one I think is the most common. You also will hear a few others. One of the common ones is the tabula rasa paradigm. And that comes from another Latin phrase, which means blank slate, where the judge says, I will check all my assumptions at the door. I will only debate, or I'll only evaluate the debate on what is presented and how well it is presented. I do think tabula rasa is not always a specific paradigm itself, but sometimes it's a commitment that many judges have no matter what their assumptions are. If you talk to any of your coaches, I'm sure a lot of them will say, I have pretty strong preferences about what is a good argument, but I don't necessarily find myself always voting for what I think are good arguments. I evaluate the debate that gets put in front of me. The important thing for kind of trying to parse between judges, if someone has been in debate and is pretty familiar with policy for a long time, and you ask them what their paradigm is, and they know enough to answer, say, I'm a stock issues judge or I'm a policymaker, you can often take them at their word. But I also want to give you a cleaner sort of way of viewing some of these paradigm divisions. I'd say if it is a person, if your judge is a person who is a community member, like a parent or maybe a local professional who's volunteering their weekend to judge at your tournament, even if they had policy experience sometime in the past, the key things that they're going to value and expect are the soundness of your reasoning and the ability for the affirmative to present a holistic case. So even if someone does not identify as a stock issues judge per se, sometimes the stock issues are a pretty common sense way of evaluating debate arguments. And so I think that it's a pretty easy paradigm that people fall into kind of naturally, because we have the expectation that the person who's playing the advocate, the person who is affirmative, is going to fulfill their role and present a coherent, full case. Then you have people that have more recent national circuit or sometimes college level experience. And the college activity differs from high school in that it's a bit more technical, and there's a lot more kind of in-depth, highly technical innovation. And that's sometimes for good and sometimes for bad. But you will often get judges who are experienced in this type of debate. These are sometimes people like such as myself who actively coach college debate and may go to a high school tournament every once in a while. It could be an active college debater who is trying to recruit for their local program, or who is an assistant coach for a local program. And so there's a bit of diversity in people who have college level experience, but generally, and I think I'm old enough to say this, my old coach would sort these into experienced college people versus what she would label college jerks. Those people who are 1 or 2 years out of high school and think they kind of know it all, they know everything, and they're kings of the world because they're in the fast, super awesome college game. And these are judges that you will encounter. And I by no means do I think that they are the best judge or even a desirable judge, depending upon the circumstances. But I also don't think any judge is the right judge other than the one that you have in front of you, because that is the challenge for you in order to adapt. But I think a central assumption to know about people who have extensive high school experience or college experience is that regardless of whether they call themselves a policymaker or tabula rasa, is that they buy into the assumption of what's kind of called the offense-defense paradigm. And this I think, is a paradigm or way of understanding debate that is useful, but definitely has its limits. And these are people that can sort of conceptually sort the arguments and ideas that are in the debate round into categories of offense and defense. And you can really borrow pretty literally from sports here to kind of tell you what is an offensive argument versus a defensive argument. So offensive arguments are ones that put points on the board for you, ones that are able to kind of let you achieve or access, should the judge vote for your case or vote for your position, some sort of impact or advantage. Defensive ones are either arguments where you are having to defend your own argument, so kind of defending from attack. So if someone says when you're affirmative that you don't solve, defensive arguments would be those sort of secondary lines of attack that say, no, we do, here are some reasons, here's some evidence that says the plan, if it was passed, would be enough to remedy the harms that we have discussed. And defensive arguments also are ones that try to attack or kind of wash out the credibility or weight of your opponent's argument. So, for example, if you were to attack an affirmative case and say, yes, we acknowledge that your harms are real, yet the affirmative plan is not enough to solve them or to overcome the barriers to those harms, that's an example of a defensive argument. The reason why offense and defense is so crucial is that for judges who are much more sort of common sense oriented, for lack of a better word, good defensive arguments are enough. They are compelling, they are strong, and if you were in the negative role and you made nothing but defensive arguments against what the affirmative case said, for those judges, and even for myself, if done well, that's enough to vote for the negative, because the affirmative has not proven beyond a doubt that they are a good idea, that they have sort of upheld their burden of proof as people advocating for change. Now, for people that are more involved in the college activity or at the more national circuit level, they may put a stronger kind of emphasis on offensive arguments, where it is not enough for the negative team to just win that the AF is not perfect or that the AF has some major flaws. Their expectation is that the negative has to prove the AF makes things worse, that they actively make the status quo, or they make the world after the plan is implemented a less desirable world to be in. So in a lot of ways, people who heavily weight winning offense have the expectation that the affirmative have a very strong advantage, and that it's able to outweigh any disadvantage impacts or critique impacts or case turns that the negative can throw at them. And by virtue of their expectations for the negative, they expect the negative to prove that the AF actively makes the world worse. So trying to boil all this down into some easy kind of rules of thumb for you, if you have a judge that you think highly values offense defense, if they look like they are pretty technically flowing the debate, if they are someone who's involved in a college program, if they are someone who's pretty recently graduated from high school and you know that they're involved in either national circuit debate or college debate, they very likely may emphasize offense over them. So your job as the affirmative, emphasize big impacts for your advantages. Your job as the negative is to prove the AF isn't just perfect, or isn't just not perfect, rather, but that they actively make things worse, that they either the AF totally backfires and they end up hurting the people that they try to help, or that the AF links to some pretty big disadvantages. Now, the good news is you don't have to be prepared to do that for a lot or even most of the judges that you encounter in Wyoming. People that are primarily involved in regional debate, as well as high school coaches or community members, are much more interested in the kind of more common sense aspects of the debate round. So when you're affirmative, your key job is to demonstrate that you have presented a fully formed and well thought out affirmative case that's able to achieve very strong common sense benefits. And your job for the negative is to show that the AF has not upheld their burden of proof, that the AF has some pretty serious weaknesses. Now, I keep using the phrase, the AF is not perfect. That's not quite the threshold you want to use. It'd be much better to point out how oftentimes the AF fails to even uphold their own promises. So if you attack their solvency and point out reasons why the plan as they've constructed it doesn't have very strong reasoning for solving their harms, or how the plan might potentially backfire, then you've done a pretty effective job of showing why the AF is fatally flawed. But I can't emphasize enough this sort of difference between offense and defense. For judges who are stock issues oriented, or are community members, focus on the key task of how strong is the AF case, and that's true whether you're affirmative or whether you're negative. For people who are more technical and are people such as myself, emphasize more offense versus defense, trying to achieve or access big impacts. The important thing to recognize, though, is that these are ways that people see the debate, the way that judges evaluate it. So you can't just assume that you're going to just slow down a little bit or speed up a little bit. If you don't change the assumptions of your arguments to fit your audience, then the judge is not going to think that you upheld your role that they expected of you. So this really is kind of a key adaptation question. Now, the next thing I want to kind of transition to is trying to establish a little bit how you can learn more about your judge. And when I judge high school debates, this is primarily what happens. I walk in the room, I set up my stuff and get ready to flow. The debaters come in and they say, what's your paradigm? And that's all they say. Now, for me, who has been around the activity for a while, that question does not throw me off. But imagine if instead of being someone who is involved in debate for 10 years, I'm a lawyer in town who's interested in supporting the local speech team who's hosting a tournament that weekend. And I go to the ballot table and I find out, oh, I got a policy debate ballot, and I have a set of instructions that says, here are the speech times, and here are the order, and here's what you should be looking for. That is all I know about debate at that point in time. That doesn't mean I'm a lay person. I don't really like that term at all, because this is the people who are willing to volunteer their time for a debate round usually are pretty smart people and are capable of understanding things at a very complex level. But they are not indoctrinated to the church of policy debate. So saying, what's your paradigm, is going to just confuse the heck out of these people. Instead, what you could be asking is, you could introduce yourself and say, hi, I'm Travis. Thank you for your taking your time this weekend. Before we get started, I was wondering if I could get a little bit of background on either your debate experience or what some of your expectations are that you're looking for. Now, if you were to ask that question of me, I know, hey, they want to know kind of what are my assumptions. So I'll tell them some of my assumptions. If it is someone who doesn't know what a paradigm is, they'll still tell you what their background is, whether they've done debate in the past or whether they're just sort of interested in finding out what the activity is. And that you can find a lot more out about who your audience is than saying something alienating like, what's your paradigm? The other question that is terrible to ask is, are you okay with speed, or are you okay with spreading? The second one is just unfortunate, and you should never ask that question. You'd never want to go through your life saying, are you okay with spreading? It doesn't make any sense. Are you okay with speed can also be disorienting, because no judge is okay with arguments that aren't clear. And debaters woefully overestimate how clear they are, even when they are reading relatively slow. The big point of this question is, if you ask someone who really has 5 minutes of experience with debate, are you okay with speed? The logical answer they might give you is, no, I'm very concerned about the spread of amphetamine in rural communities. Like, what does it mean to ask someone point blank, are you okay with speed? It's very disorienting, and also won't give you the answer that you are looking for. You can infer a lot more about your judge's answers if you just ask them what their experience is with the activity and what brings them out for the round this weekend. It also helps establish a little bit of a connection between you and the judge. Now, a few other things that you can infer or read from the judge are some of the nonverbal signals that they are presenting you even as they walk into the room. If I walk into the room, what I do is I might ask for paper if I happen to forget it, or I'll pull out several sheets of legal paper. I'll grab a fistful of pins. I'll set my debate timer out on the desk. And that every single step that I just said that I do in my everyday life is sending signals to you about what I came here to do when I was assigned this ballot. It indicates that I'm very interested in flowing. I'm going to pay a lot of attention to the technical details of the debate, and I want to know how well teams are clashing with each other on the line-by-line level of the flow. Those signals, plus any answer I get that you get from asking me kind of like what my experience is, and that sort of greeting we talked about earlier, will tell you a ton about what types of arguments are acceptable. It'll tell you far more than asking, are you okay with critiques? Or are you okay with speed? Because sometimes people don't want to say, no, I'm not, or they don't want to say, what the hell are you talking about? That doesn't make any sense to me. Oftentimes people, when they're in unfamiliar situations, they may feign that they know what's going on. You've done it, I've done it, your judges may do it. So try to read your judge in terms of the signals that they are sending. If someone comes to the round and they're not prepared to flow at all, they don't have any paper, they don't have a pen, they've not indicated they're going to take notes, you should adapt and read that as a signal. You should not be overly involved in a highly technical debate. As a funny anecdote, a former debate partner of mine, when he was in high school, had a judge who said he was experimenting with not flowing. And instead of taking that under consideration, he decided to go for topicality at a very fast rate of speed. And topicality is one of the most intricate and technically oriented things, especially if you're trying to go super fast and be all high school circuit awesome about it. And with not much of a surprise, the round did not end well for him. You should have read more of a message off of what the judge was sending in terms of how they set themselves up to flow and record the debate. If someone comes in and they're just taking a few notes on the ballot, it also kind of indicates that they're not as familiar with debate and are not really invested in the line by line. They're going to listen to your arguments and your ideas. They're going to listen to your overall presentation, but they're going to kind of view things a bit more holistically. And this sort of idea of kind of seeing how the judge sets themselves up to judge falls in between in a variety of places. There could be people that are flowing on a single sheet of paper. Someone who has their flow sheet set out so that they have an AF page and a neg page. There's lots of different ways to set up and flow a debate, but how the judge is showing that they're trying to record the debate tells you a lot about what their experience with the activity is. If I have 10 sheets of paper, then I'm ready to flow each affirmative position on its own sheet and each negative off case position on its own sheet. If I'm set up to flow the whole debate on a single sheet, I want to know, I want to have fewer issues. I want to have a slower debate that tries to unpack and attack a limited amount of ideas that are present in the affirmative case. If you were to see that judge and just say, all right, well, they said that they're okay with speed, so even though they're flowing on one sheet, let me grab 5 disadvantages, and then maybe the case, and then maybe a topicality argument in case I get to it. That doesn't make any sense. That does not set you up for being successful. So you have to read these signals very early on, and you have to follow through in how you adapt and change, because adaptation is not changing how fast you talk. Adaptation is changing how you argue. The reason why we went through all those paradigms is to show you judges have different expectations and they have different ways of viewing the world. Now, the next thing that I want to talk a little bit about before seeing if we have any questions that come across the live stream is to talk a little bit more about the sort of adaptation that begins back at school when you're preparing your materials, or back at the kitchen table wherever you're doing your debate work. There's a variety of lessons that you have to learn in terms of how you set yourself up to debate, in terms of the blocks that you write and the way that you arrange your evidence. I'll start with talking about how to prepare from the affirmative perspective. If you know that, broadly speaking, there's 2 types of judges out there: those that want to hear a well-reasoned, common sense, in-depth case, and that's going to be the focus of the debate in their mind, versus those who are offense, defense. They want to hear about impacts. They want to hear about advantages. That tells you you need to have at least 2 versions of an affirmative case. And the key thing is that the first affirmative case, the one that is geared for the judge who wants to focus on the common sense issues, really should be a fully produced piece of rhetoric. It should be able to have an introduction with some polish. It should tell the judge some of the key ideas that you're going to explore in the debate, and should also throughout the debate, or throughout the 1AC, it should look for ways to reinforce the central message or the idea of what your affirmative is. Additionally, you want to also present evidence in a way that calls attention to the quality of the evidence and also works well as a piece of rhetoric, as a piece of public speaking. If you think about it, even if you slow down and you're super eloquent, you're extremely articulate, and you still introduce your pieces of evidence in the same way, think about how awkward or jarring that sounds. If I say, now is a pivotal time in US-Chinese relations, we have only a diminishing window in order to lock in some gains on the political front before tensions could possibly spiral out of control. And then you say, Smith, 2016. and then you just read this evidence in monotone, it's extremely, it takes the judge out of the equation where they're not listening to your evidence, but are rather thinking about what the hell are you doing? What is going on? Your evidence really should play a role in heightening and strengthening your message. So that means you have to change up your tags. You have to have a little bit more explanation in your taglines. You also want to be able to present your qualifications in a way that's pleasing to the ear and calls attention to the quality of your argument. So rather than Jones 2016, you could say, according to Michael Jones, who is a professor of international relations at Harvard, who writes in a recent magazine article, yada, yada. So the key thing is you want to be able to make your evidence work for you, for the judge and their expectations. I also would recommend picking evidence that sometimes is more rhetorically powerful, or even perhaps reading less of your evidence and focusing more so on your own analysis, so that the 1AC, your analysis doesn't just enter into the equation with your taglines, but rather you really create kind of a synthesis between good analytic explanation and explanation via your evidence. But if you prepare your 1AC in this manner, then you have a strong speech that can stand on its own and leaves an impression in the judge's mind that you really did your homework and you take your burden of proof seriously. Now, the affirmative case for the types of judges who look for that offense, defense, that more technically oriented stuff can have simple, straightforward taglines and can have last name and year for the author for the citation of the evidence. And it can focus more so on the research that you have in front of you, because those judges will carefully consider the evidence that you did bring to the table. That doesn't mean that things like persuasion and good rhetoric are out of the equation. Those still play an important role, especially in cross-examination and in the last rebuttals. But those judges have different assumptions. So you should make sure that you set yourself up to satisfy those assumptions. And that does take work that you cannot just riff on. If you tell yourself, I'm going to write this huge affirmative with 40 cards and 5 nuclear war scenarios, and then I'll just kind of wing it if we get a judge that doesn't want to hear any of that stuff, you're going to wing it poorly. I'm someone who has seen public speaking, whether it's from students in a classroom or whether it's from debaters, literally thousands of times. You cannot do it well, particularly not under pressure. So you have to prepare, polish, and practice for those different things. If you don't prepare for the different judges that you will encounter, then you shouldn't expect to do well in front of those that you just blew off because you said their time isn't important. And that's relatively terrible. They're giving up 90 minutes of their day to hear you talk. And I know you love hearing you talk because you're a debater, but your judge should be foremost in your mind. Now, in terms of what this means for negative preparation, it means you have to also prepare for both worlds. You need to do research against teams and affirmative cases that you are very likely to hear. If you're in Wyoming, you've already had a month full of debate travel. You know what is out there. You know what people are saying, and people often don't just change at the drop of a hat. So what you should be doing is doing some on-case research that attacks the solvency and harms and advantage claims that are made of these affirmative cases. And this type of research will come in handy no matter who your audience is, because even people that are offense, defense oriented, defense still plays a role. There's a reason that you try to get good at defense in football and basketball, because even though you still have to put points on the board, the more you do to prevent your opponent from putting those points up, the more successful you're going to be. So this type of on-case research is infinitely valuable. You will get so much return on the work that you do here. It also is the best thing to focus on when you're going to a really large tournament, or when you're going to, say, the NSDA Nationals tournament. Trying to attack people's cases, especially their solvency, even if it's defensive, can get you a long way in debate. Now, beyond that, you do want to have one or two strong disadvantages, or if you're in a region that sees a lot of people who are amenable to critical or philosophical arguments, trying to pick one that you think can apply in a lot of situations. Um, and it really does kind of come down to how large of a team you're on, how many people are doing a bit of work. If you have a pretty large team and every single kind of 2N debater who's in charge of the negative research for that partnership, if they commit to cutting one position really in depth and everyone on your team kind of shares that workload and does a little bit of everything, then you can get prepared for a lot of debates. If you're blessed with being on a squad with a lot of debaters, work together collectively to make your burden smaller, and that way you can prepare for a lot more debates. But me as if I were a 2N and it's getting to be tournament time, it's Wednesday and I know that I'm going to be traveling out on Friday, I want to know that even if I were to get a judge who is more offense defense oriented, that I have one or two disadvantages in my files that I can rely on and that are pretty strong and that I've done a lot of work to prepare for. That means you got to do a little bit more work than just grabbing a pre-prepared camp file and just kind of making up what's going on as you think about it. You do have to sort of think through what are the types of affirmatives. Can I think of 3 or 4 strong disadvantages that would apply to a big chunk of the types of cases that are out there? And can I make them stick, even if they're not hyper specific? And if you do that and couple it with a few counterplan arguments to help kind of resolve other affirmative cases, or maybe even a important topicality argument, those types of arguments will not rub judges like me the wrong way. So you want to have them at your availability just in case they become useful. And that way you can be prepared to kind of run and gun with those audiences that expect more technical debate or that enjoy more technical debate. The big emphasis, though, is to recognize that I am not the best audience, or I'm not even also the most common audience, nor are people like me who have a lot of college experience. So you do have to seriously prepare for any audience. And at times when I was young, I had the kind of mindset that I don't want to prep for those judges. That's not like the fun type of debate. But as I got more debate experience in high school, I realized that the fun was in the challenge of kind of cracking the nut that is your audience, kind of figuring out what's going on in their head and adapting your arguments on the fly. And nothing is more satisfying than when you adapt and your opponent didn't, and your opponent walks out of there thinking, oh, I was so amazing. They did a terrible job answering my arguments. And you know kind of in your heart that you're the one who made the connection with the judge. So prepare for any audience and take it seriously, because that is the challenge. And what I have found actually is it makes you stronger in nearly any facet of life, whether it's just debate itself. I think that Wyoming debaters were so successful on the national circuit and continue to be successful on the national circuit because they understand a diversity of audiences and they're willing to adapt their arguments to different contingencies and different circumstances. But also I think that it helps you be enormously successful throughout life because every person you'll interact with in college or in life as you enter the workforce and you start growing older, the more you can do to sort of tailor your message, no matter the circumstance, the more successful you can be. So the final thing before I turn it over to see if there's any comments that people have, I think adaptation is something that policy debaters have an obligation to take seriously. The reputation for our activity among a lot of people is honestly a bit in the gutter. They think that policy debaters are too fast, too technical, don't pay attention, blow off their judges. And the worst thing that you can do is confirm that belief. I believe that policy debaters are sometimes very committed to the activity, willing to let their passions kind of drive them. And I think that if they take adaptation seriously and sort of see the challenge in front of them, there's no reason that the activity can't let people know that policy debate is no particular thing. The only thing that makes policy debate what it is the time slots and the topic. The successful policy debate is one that's able to match effectively with your judges. So with that, I'm going to start taking through a few questions that come across the live feed. So I have, do technical judges appreciate card analysis? I think they do, and they definitely weight it, but I think that the important thing is it's a question of how you want to draw out the implication of card analysis. So if there is a flaw in your opponent's card, like say, for example, their card, a key piece of evidence on their advantage is about something similar to their plan, but not about the plan itself, then you have to be able to not just say, that's not a great card, you also have to say, it's about something else. And that means the AF doesn't apply for this reason. So you have to sort of draw the full connection. In terms of disadvantage card analysis, I think that technical judges value this, and what they'll do is they'll attach a little sexy label to it that they call spin. The key thing is generic pieces of evidence can apply. The important thing to recognize is that when an affirmative challenges it by saying that's generic, that could apply to anything. The important thing to point out is perhaps it is generic, but it's especially true in this instance. Perhaps introduce some more specific evidence or give some detailed analysis for why the plan is a particularly good example of how your link is true. The other thing that you can do to get around this is to sort of point out that, excuse me, the other thing you can do to get around this is to point out that the kind of overall uniqueness portions of the disadvantage may mean that even if the link argument is generic and could possibly apply to other things, if your uniqueness argument proves that those other things aren't happening, then generic evidence can still be a strong fit. The next question is whether we should run disadvantages on stock issues judges and less experienced ones. And I think that you definitely should read those disadvantages because while I do think the stock issues are sometimes common sense and kind of are intuitive, so also is the idea of offense. If people can understand and appreciate that a policy may not just be weakly reasoned, but also has a chance of making things worse. The important thing for disadvantages is that you should recognize that for stock issues or for judges without a lot of experience, oftentimes you don't need to push it to the point of extremes in terms of your impact. If you have a good argument for, let's say, an economy disadvantage, that the affirmative would cost too much money and very likely damage the strength of our economy, for an offense-defense person, you have to go, which would then cause an economic meltdown, which would then cause war, which would then escalate to nuclear war. All those levels of absurdity that come on that back end aren't necessary. If you are a normal breathing adult like myself, economic damage is unpleasant and undesirable. And if you can argue that the affirmative weakens the strength of the economy, causes people to lose jobs, or even just increases the general rate of instability in the world, that's enough. So the important thing, I think, for disadvantages is they need to kind of tune down some of the more hyperbolic and extreme tendencies for stock issues judges and for judges that are community members. Now, in terms of the other questions such as topicality, critiques, and counterplans, are those other off-case positions appropriate for judges that more strongly emphasize stock issues? For the most part, no. And I do think that your default setting, your sort of key assumption should be keep those in the tub. I'll talk through the exceptions to those. The first is in terms of criticisms, if your critique is very kind of like high theory oriented, if you're talking about Michel Foucault and European philosophy and neoliberalism, those things just aren't going to fly, mostly because the judge may not have the context to really know what the heck you're talking about, and also may think that it's just a total distraction because their assumption is debate the case. That said, if you think the AF makes arguments that are perhaps unethical, and by that I don't mean like unethical in their presentation, like they stole evidence or manufactured evidence, but rather are racist or have assumptions that are problematic. If you think it's a judge who'd be sympathetic to those claims, you can make critical type arguments that are still kind of in the vein of critiquing some of the ethical assumptions of what the affirmative is. So that I think is the trick for critiques. The big rule of thumb, though, I think those are the places where you're playing with fire the most with judges who aren't experienced. In terms of counterplans, I think that counterplans for more stock issues oriented judging or community judging can work, but I think that a lot of people have the expectation that the counterplan won't be topical, and also that it will be meaningfully different. So you will have to change how you argue your counterplan a little bit, but anyone can figure out, hey, the AF has a policy, but we have a different policy that does not risk causing an economic decline, but it can achieve the similar benefits to what the AF is. That's something that can make sense if well and clearly explained. If you dress it up in jargon like competition and net benefits and permutations, you're going to lose your audience. They're not going to know what the heck you're talking about. So you do have to change the jargon and the terms that you use to explain the position. If it's counterplans that are like process counterplans where you do the entire affirmative, but you change this tiny little political process in doing so, those are not going to fly at all because the judge will think that there's not enough disagreement between you and the AF and that you're really just kind of agreeing with the AF. Topicality, also I would recommend avoiding if your topicality argument is kind of a strategic argument. And what I mean by that is if the affirmative has a pretty compelling, or at the very least, you wouldn't laugh at it, argument for why they are topical, then T should probably be off the table. You should not read it because they want to focus more so on the content and the reasoning of the case. And if it does seem that the AF is pretty common sense topical and fits under the purview of the topic, then I would put your T arguments away. So what I mean by that on this year's topic, if you were to say, if you're always saying that engagement means that it has to be conditional, and you're reading that 100% of the time against judges who don't have any experience with debate, they're going to think that you're just rambling on about nothing and that you have not responded to the case. The exception for topicality is if they are just grossly off the mark, if they are not even in the realm of trying to be topical. So for example, on the weapons of mass destruction high school topic many years ago, people from my team were hitting an affirmative case that dealt with, I think it was radiological weapons, when the core of the topic was dealing with nuclear weapons. So we were able to argue in this round that they just were not even within the ballpark. The important thing is, to a judge that doesn't know about topicality, you have to spend a lot of time explaining the theory of topicality, how it's an affirmative burden, what topicality means, how the judge would know who has won or lost on topicality. And as a result, you can't just make T a passing issue in the debate. You have to be willing to make it a central focus because you have to invest so much time explaining it. So I really would suggest that if you're reading T mostly from a strategic perspective, i.e., you have an argument, but it's pretty technical, and it's all going to come down to the minutia of interpretations and definitions and all that jazz, stay away with these types of judges. Do consider T if you think they're just not even close to the topic, but recognize your burden for winning that argument could be a bit higher. I'll give you another second to see if there's any other questions that come across, but I think we're near the end of our hour. Well, I'm not seeing anything else, so I hope you all enjoyed this. If you do have follow-up questions, feel free to either post it on the Wyoming Debate Facebook wall, or you can send me an email at Travis Cram, C-R-A-M, at gmail.com, and either myself or one of my debaters will get back to you. And I hope you all are enjoying your season, and good luck out there. Thank you.